Video's rolling.
Donde mouse.
Audio is rolling. Okay.
Alright.
Hello and welcome to Four Dudes in Winston's Basement.
Not really his basement.
Today we will be discussing how different factors influenced U.S. military, diplomatic, and economic involvement in international affairs, both in North America and overseas. This is Asim, this is Chris, and this is Armando. He will be our expert on periods 1 through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 9. So Asim, if you'd like to begin.
Alright, so not much happens in period 1. The only international related thing would be the Columbian Exchange, which was the exchange of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between America, Europe, the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And also the Atlantic slave trade started by the Portuguese in 1526. Period 2 would be indentured servitude, in which people could sign a contract in which they agreed to work for a certain amount of years in exchange for transportation in North America. Mercantilism, which is a political economy based on government regulation. The Middle Passage, which is part of the triangular trade where Africans, densely packed in ships, were transported across the Atlantic to the West Indies and North and South America. And lastly, Salutary Neglect, which was British colonial policy during the reigns of George I and II. It allowed for the rise of American self-government as the royal supervision of intercolonial affairs was relaxed. Period 3 had the tea, stamp, quartering, townshend, coercive, sugar, and declaratory acts, and they all directly led to colonial resentment towards the British, which eventually led to the American Revolution. George Grenville was responsible for Currency, Sugar, and Stamp Act. Colonists began to push for the non-importation movement, which is the push to stop importation of British goods. The First Continental Congress was created, and the Sons of Liberty to protest the Stamp Act. Then the Second Continental Congress, which was governed through the American Revolution, which created an army, a currency, and eventually declared independence from Britain. An important person during this period would have been Ben Franklin, who was the ambassador to France during the Revolutionary War, and he negotiated a treaty with France. The Battle of Lexington and Concord was the first battle in the start of the Revolutionary War, and Washington's farewell address, which warned against political parties and the formation of permanent alliances.
So, pretty much the main reason why not much happened for your segment is pretty much for periods 1 and 2, America's not their own political entity.
Yeah,
right?
they're just
a British colony.
Yeah, it's part of the British still.
And then period 3 is mostly armed citizenry.
Yep.
Farmers with guns. We can't the army's not really much of a thing. It was established, but not very professional because Articles of Confederation wasn't very strong at that time.
And of course, the articles themselves would cause the U.S. to not be a very diplomatic
Country. Yep.
Yeah, not very diplomatic until the Constitution itself
was created. Yep.
And pretty much at this point, it's just self-preservation.
Yep.
We're not really. We're kind of minding our own thing. Washington's farewell address. We're not really. We don't have any permanent alliances. We're not getting involved with Europe. We did have an alliance with France, and then broke it less than 20 years later. So then, and then around that time, there were political parties that formed, and they started to argue over who to side with, which kind of directly contradicted George Washington. And then there was the transition from Federalists to Democratic Republicans with the Revolution of 1800, which brings us into your part.
Yeah, into period 4, it was mainly Jefferson continued the neutrality of Washington and Adams, but he expanded to more diplomatic ventures, especially economically, and mostly just tried to stay neutral in all the wars because America was just becoming its own and couldn't really afford to fight a war. So some major examples are the Louisiana Purchase, and throughout the entire Napoleonic Wars in Europe, they pretty much stayed neutral except for a small fight with the Barbary pirates, and that was only to protect. And that was that. There isn't really much. James Madison replaces Jefferson, and he enacts a couple bills to economically distance the United States from Britain and France, mostly because he didn't want to get caught up in the war. And actually, because of that, that led to the United States getting into the War of 1812 with Britain. Mostly between trade routes and the idea of some colonists, the idea of the frontier was being impeded on by the British. Mainly from there on, there was a lot of... After 1812, there was a very aggressive nationalistic approach with pretty much any diplomatic ventures. And there were some treaties between the U.S. and Britain, mostly because of the war. They had a little bit more contact after that. And then there was the Addo-Nice Treaty with Spain, which gave them pretty much Florida and Spain's claims to the Oregon territories. And after that, there was the first prominent Monroe Doctrine, which, although wasn't enforced, was an important precursor for later with James Polk. That is like the first time the U.S. established a boundary where no other European countries could interfere with. And then to period 5, the idea of manifest destiny, mostly consumed by expansionism. There was the denied annexation of Texas, and that was to prevent getting in a war with Mexico at the time. And then there was some boundary disputes in Oregon, and then a fight with the British. And then with the election of Polk, that greatly influenced a bunch of diplomatic relations. We annexed Texas, and then we killed some British people, and then kind of just moved
the entirety of the West Coast.
Yeah, moved around it. And then we crushed the Mexicans in the war, and so we acquired California, New Mexico, and Texas. And then we tried to buy Cuba with the Ostend Manifesto, but really not much else happened. Yep. And then after that, the Civil War greatly influenced pretty much all diplomatic ventures because we were just so focused on ourselves that there wasn't really much interaction between the U.S. and other European nations.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you think are some similarities and continuity? You know what I mean.
Between
changes and continuities.
That's the one.
Between 4 through 5, really, because 6 was pretty much just Civil War. There was a lot of. It was the actual. Well, because of the changing of governments a couple of times, specifically with Jefferson, we had varying diplomatic approaches depending on the president. James Polk was very aggressive, and Madison was to a degree as well, and Jefferson was very neutral. So a lot of it was based on what presidency and also what the main goal at the time was, like manifest destiny. We got into a lot more conflict with European nations then than we did with Jefferson and neutrality. So a big factor is the presidency.
So do you think that like at this point we started to extend our reach into the rest of the Western Hemisphere?
Definitely, especially with the Monroe Doctrine. There was a great factor in actually asserting ourselves as a political entity, and especially because we never did that before.
So like the Monroe Doctrine was our way of like telling Europe to stay out. So that's kind of a different purpose for what it was eventually later used as.
Yeah, it was later used as a justification for imperialism.
Do you think that's what Monroe wanted, what he intended? Or do you think that was like an early sign of imperialism, implicit imperialism?
I think it was actually a defense maneuver to prevent European influence that would backlash to the United States, because we were trying to avoid all European alliances, and them interfering with Latin America would be a little bit too close for home. And I don't think Monroe had any like imperialistic ideas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And like, there's something that's like kind of unique to your part of American history, which is American interaction with Native American tribes. Would you consider that as international affairs, since they are kind of their own political entity, or like because it is kind of in our own backyard, but
with actual interactions, it was more of pretty much all military interactions. Not much diplomatic ventures were tried much until later, and even then sometimes it was just backlash with Andrew Jackson. So a lot of the not really, there wasn't much real diplomatic interaction. All the interaction there was usually just pushing them back into the frontier or just stomping over their homeland.
okay. So then, like, yeah, after this, like, during Civil War, nothing really happened. No one really wants to, like, intervene, trade.
No.
It's pretty dangerous. And then after that, we get into the Reconstruction Era, and we start getting a lot more imperialist, which then, you know, brings us into your part.
Yeah. By the end of the 19th century, the U.S. has pretty much no frontier left. The term manifest destiny is essentially dying, so many are brought to believe that the U.S. has no more goals. That unfortunately is not the case, as the U.S. was brought into the Spanish-American Wars. They receive a variety of new territories in the Pacific, such as the Philippines, and then they don't receive Cuba, but they do have it as a puppet state. This would thrust the U.S. into a new era of imperialism. With the Roosevelt corollary, of course, it would expand the Monroe Doctrine and it established U.S. dominance in the Americas, and it essentially protected the sovereignty of other Latin American countries. Also, there's neocolonization in Latin America with the United Fruit Company and what would be called the Banana States?
Banana Republics.
Banana Republics, yes. Alfred Thayer Maine theorizes that if you have a superior navy, you could dominate in war. And then the Great White Fleet patrols the rest of the world to show how great the U.S. is. So in World War I, the U.S. pretty much remains neutral. And then after the Lusitania sinking and then the Zimmermann telegram by Germany to Mexico, the U.S. finally joins the Allies against the Central Powers. Once World War I is won, the U.S. does become a creditor nation for the first time, and it lends money to both Britain and the Central Powers, which are in ruins. After the war, isolationism is a deep contrast to the period that preceded it. The U.S. stays alone by itself, really, and refuses to join the League of Nations, which was originally proposed by Woodrow Wilson. The U.S. does remain isolated throughout the 20s and in the 30s in the Great Depression. The idea of this would be to revive domestic industry, but this was unsuccessful. Finally, Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor would thrust the U.S. into another world war, and this time it would make the nation a huge world power in the Allies. After World War II, the U.S. pretty much remained the largest power, both militarily and financially, along with its industry. And then after that, the U.S. finally changes by becoming a diplomatic and military superpower, rivaling that of the USSR. And then the U.S. Adopts a new doctrine, which would pretty much be named the Truman Doctrine, to stop the USSR and its expansion, along with stopping the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan is enacted to help Western Europe recover from the destruction of the war. Throughout the period, both powers, such as the USSR and the US, would amass such a large arsenal of nuclear weapons that mutually assured destruction would pretty much lead to both being too scared to go to war and in fear to destroy the entire world. Brinkmanship rises up as a way to stop war as well, through straining relations almost to their breaking point. A lot of Latin American countries also almost become communist, but the U.S. does interfere and does its best to prevent this from happening. This would be unsuccessful in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs incident. And finally, after that, there would be the Cuban Missile Crisis directly from the Bay of Pigs accident, really. And after that, there's a lot of proxy wars that the U.S. engages in with the USSR, specifically the Vietnam War. This would spark a lot of public outrage and controversy, and this marks a shift from the public not only supporting and backing government activities, but also keeping it in check and preventing it from violating any human rights, really. And then the U.S. does intervene a lot of times in the Middle East. This would create a lot of instability in the area, with leaders such as Saddam Hussein rising up. And because of its escapades, incidents such as 9/11 would be enacted, really. And after the fall of the USSR, the U.S. does still remain the prominent world power. After 9/11, public outrage sparks direct action in the war against terrorism, and it causes the U.S. to declare on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And then finally, suspicions of possessing weapons of mass destruction would lead to the U.S. declaring war on Iraq once again, and then finally deposing Gaddafi in Libya. And most recently, NAFTA was established to promote cooperation between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico.
Which pretty much brings us to the modern day. And so there's this trend that goes on in U.S. history that kind of stopped pretty much along with the abandonment of George Washington's farewell address, where we would go to war and our military would grow, and then after it's over, it just shrank. We'd go isolationist again, and the World War II was where that ended. Pretty much, we became an international player for political, economic reasons. Probably like the main reason why our army didn't really shrink at all was because of the USSR and the Comintern. Mm-hmm. Do you guys think that if that wasn't a thing, that we might still be isolationists now?
We probably would.
Yeah, we probably would have.
Yeah.
But now, the world market is generally shared with the U.S. and all of the countries in the world are connected in one way or another.
So if we were to mark a beginning, middle, and not really end, just really now, we'd see it's kind of like a timeline of we first focused on ourselves, then our half of the world, and then just the rest of the world is. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, pretty much the general trend is a period of isolationism and then a war we're pretty much forced into, because that happened with, I don't know if we could technically call it forced in the Revolutionary War, but the Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812, and then finally with the World Wars. It's always an international war that usually pulls us out of the isolationist period.
Alright, well, that's pretty much all our time. Thank you, Mr. Cooper, for listening to our discussion.
Yes.
Turning off the video feed, get the audio out.